I have a question about liver transplant. It seems like ASA, and apparently I didn't know this before today, it's a rare within rare disease, right? It's a very particular one that doesn't seem to be responding to any of the treatment options, like any of the cure options as a resolving fully. So to follow up with that, is gene therapy available after transplantation? Is that something that, because I know you said the opposite thing.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you for that question. It's a really interesting question. Arginine-succinic acid lyase, or the ASA, is, it's not the most rare of the urea cycle disorders, but all of these things are very rare, and we are learning. ASA is, that enzyme is part of the urea cycle, but it also does other things in other parts of the body, and that's really what makes it a little bit different from some of the other urea cycle defects that we're talking about. And I think your question about then, would gene therapy be available after a liver transplant? That's a hard question to answer until there is a gene therapy for ASA, but it would probably need to be specifically designed to target other tissues besides the liver. And there would probably need to be a study done that would show that it was safe for the transplanted liver to do the gene therapy after the liver transplant to treat other tissues, particularly blood vessels and kidneys and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question for each one. So about the diet, you mentioned sushi in your slide. And I was like, really, sushi? But I remember we are big sushi eaters at home. And so in order to include my little one, I thought, oh, well, let me just give him some veggie sushi, right? But he didn't want veggie sushi. He wanted to eat seaweed sushi. So we would go to this restaurant, they would give him all the ingredients, and that was the thing. He would make himself a seaweed salad sushi roll. And so I was super excited about this alternative, and I called Cindy one time, and I was like, oh my God, we found a great thing that Anders can eat. It's sushi, and so she goes, what? And I was like, yeah, just not the fish, seaweed. And she's like, that is extremely high in glutamine. What are you doing? So I was like, okay. And so I guess my question is, are we providing families enough knowledge, or do we need to be providing families enough knowledge also about other nutrients that would be toxic for our kids, not just protein? But do we watch the glutamine as well? And also now post-transplant, do I have to be worried about glutamine still?
So there hasn't been a good correlation between how much glutamine might be in your diet and what that then translates to your blood levels, right? So when we're talking about following glutamine levels, that glutamine is mostly coming from sort of the excess nitrogen that's around, and it's not coming from the diet specifically, the food itself, yeah. And so, nobody has necessarily looked at that, right? Like looked to see, but glutamine is, because it's made in the body, right? It's one of those non-essential amino acids that our body's gonna make. We're gonna get a little bit from our food, but most of that is coming from the degradation of the amino acids and not from the diet. Sort of to your other point, I do think that we focus so much on protein that sometimes we forget about everything else in sort of healthy nutrition and healthy eating. And so I do think it is worth thinking about other aspects of the diet and where you can get benefits beyond just like focusing on that protein number itself.
So are you more of the thought, like the line of treatment that you don't count, you don't think that counting protein in itself or the quality of protein? Because also, like I saw pasta, my son loved pasta, but I carried around until I learned to eyeball 100 grams of spaghetti because it was going to be 8 grams of protein, and that was going to be too much for him. So we were always following like formula first, and then we supplement with the food. So is that something that you still recommend?
It's really dependent on the sort of spectrum and where that
Okay.
individual falls. You know, I have some patients that are not counting protein because their protein tolerance, the amount that their body can handle, is so much that we don't have to really worry about it. Other than we know that patients with urea cycle disorders self-limit their protein. And so a lot of times what I'm focusing on with some of my patients is actually making sure they're getting in enough protein, because, you know, we'll do a 24-hour recall and someone will say chicken nuggets, and I'll be like, oh, what, tell me a little bit more about that. And they say, oh, no, they just like eat off the breading on the outside and throw the chicken part away, right? Like that's how they eat chicken nuggets. And so it's really talking to families and also making sure that they're meeting that minimum amount. So for some of my individuals, you know, some of my patients, there is a focus on making sure they're getting in their formula and their calories from that, and sort of food second. But I would say most of my patients, our focus is on food and supplementing if we have to with the medical food. Yeah.
Thanks. And lastly, about the research, we participated in every research. I'm still out looking like, is there a new research? Which we just did. And so about consent and about like participation, sometimes throughout the trial, because they're trying things and you don't really know, there might be side effects. And so what is your recommendation for families? Because for us, when we started Ravicti trial, it was very, very hard. And I was about to pull them out. I was like, this is bad. We just want to stop. And I remember having a conversation with the team, and their concern was like, listen, if you pull out, I can't put you back in. So you can't like reconsent.
No, that's true.
Okay, so, and so also a lot of those side effects were just a part of like that initial stage. And so, you know, what is your recommendation for into making that decision when to pull the plug? And you say like,
That's really hard because it's such an individual one. But if it's so that your child or you have such impact in your life that you just can't tolerate what you're going through, you need to discuss it with your study team. If there are things that they can change in the context of the trial to try and improve that, they certainly will. But sometimes they will not have the ability to do that. And if that's the case, you really, even if you want to be in the trial, maybe you shouldn't be. And that's a hard thing for me to say, because I want people to be safely engaged and to see it through and for it to be helpful to them. But that may not be the case, and it certainly isn't the case for every person. It just isn't.
well, they did encourage us to stay, and we stayed.
Yeah.
And it was fine.
Yeah.
So
We,
that's okay, right?
yeah, you know, absolutely. It's okay to talk it through with your team, and you should, because you're partners in this. But they need to know what problems you're having, because they need to share that back and saying, you know, half my people are saying I have XYZ problem, and then everybody needs to stop and think about what's going on. All of that kind of information is really essential to the trial, so you must speak up and you must share what problems you're having. Sometimes they can be fixed and sometimes they can't. But it's really important that you feel free to speak up about them and that you share them, because if change needs to be made because side effects are getting in the way, then they need to adjust for that and somehow.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add one thought to that, and that is that in most trials, there's what's called the primary outcome part of the study, and that may be 26 weeks or something, but there's some period of time where that is the most critical time where they're comparing, especially in a phase 3, the placebo to the active component. And at the end of that, there may be what's called an open label extension, where everybody knows they're getting the drug, there's fewer visits, but that's a natural time that if you want to drop out, that's a natural time to do that without really causing problems for the study. So if you can make it through that principal period, that's probably the most important part.
The extension study is still part of the research, though. Yes. Keep going. Go for it.
My question is for Dr. McCandless, although others can answer. So in your talk, you emphasize that gene therapy is probably not going to be a cure, and that retreatment, you know, something that we should be thinking about might be needed. So my question is, how does this relate to cost? And you talked about that as well, right, in your talk. And so, given that the price of some of these blockbuster gene therapies on the market now, we're a community that has, a lot of us are on Ravicti, huge cost there. mRNA therapeutics might require these weekly infusion. There's going to be, major costs there. So the question there is about cost. What does this look like 5 years down the line? Where do you think we could end up with the cost of all these therapeutics?
That's a great question. I don't have a crystal ball. If all of the potential gene therapies that are in the pipeline turn out to be effective, that's a question that as a society we're going to have to address in the next 10 years, I think, about the cost. I will say, though, because urea cycle disorders are so rare, that it's probably not going to be such a huge issue for our community in the foreseeable future. And as I said, I'm very optimistic that we're going to find ways to make this work for our patients in the future. And I want to be really careful because I don't know if retreatment's going to be necessary for some of the gene therapies. We think that there's certainly potential for that, but it's really hard to know. And most of the ones that have been done so far seem to be lasting for quite well. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic about that. If for another talk, I have some slides too that look at if you look at total healthcare spending in the United States, which is almost as many zeros as in the dose of gene therapy that you get every year, trillions of dollars every year. Even if we were to have a gene therapy for 100 more diseases, it's really going to be not more than 2 or 3% of the total healthcare spending in the United States. So I think it's important for us to be concerned about this, but I think these are things that we're going to be able to deal with as a society.
I have some questions for you as well. Sorry. You mentioned the AAV8 is the one that you're using now, and that it targets the liver but other organs as well. So if it attaches to the heart or the pancreas, are there side effects of that? Is that bad, or is it just not effective at all?
That's a great question. So if you treat other cells other than the target cells, there's at least right now no known harm in that, except for the small risk of the gene therapy itself, of the vector getting interrupting the DNA of that cell that it's entering, and the very unlikely but not impossible risk of causing cancer in another tissue. Most of the cancers that have been that people are concerned about are in the blood cells, which kind of makes sense because blood cells turn over the most. They're constantly turning over, and so they're dividing, and that's maybe that makes sense. I'm not sure about that, but I think that to my knowledge, there has not been, certainly for the urea cycle drugs so far, and for other things, there hasn't been any necessarily concerns about treating other tissues. And your body has, those genes are present in every tissue, they're just not active.
Okay. And the second question is, you mentioned that the treatment facilities that do the trials have plans in place to help with the inflammation that sometimes happens. What are those plans?
Yeah, not as great as you would like, unfortunately, in many of our centers, but typically it's that we know the right questions to ask for if there are problems, or we know that when a family calls and says, hey, I'm red all over and my joints hurt, that we know what we should be thinking about. We know what blood tests to order. In my institution in Colorado, we have sort of a written protocol for how to respond to those inflammatory situations. And I think I feel fairly confident that as these therapies become more widespread and more common, that those are going to become standardized protocols that will be widely available, and everybody will have them and know how to deal with things.
Thank you. And a question for the nutritionist. Thank you. How do you deal with food aversion? And I sometimes wonder, whether to broach those boundaries. Because, you know, to me and to my husband, it seems like we should be exploring more variety and, you know, encouraging our daughter to try new things. But then when we go and see our metabolic team or talk to other families, they aren't terribly concerned with the amount of variety or lack thereof. So, you know, is it something that I should push, or is that a battle that I don't need to fight?
I think it's exactly in what you said. Is it a battle, right?
Right.
And if it becomes a battle, we don't want mealtime to be a war every night, right? And so, you know, and I think it also depends on what is that aversion? Is it sort of a textural thing? Is it a taste thing? And if it's an aversion that can be overcome with, you know, feeding therapy or occupational therapy, that's sort of separate from the mealtime, right? Yeah. You know, I think the idea and research sort of in general pediatric nutrition is, you know, offering foods frequently, modeling those so that you're eating the peas just like you want your kids to eat the peas, and that they're exposed to it. The hope is one day they will eat it. And so I think keeping that mindset that, you know, they, particularly if they're on, you know, a multivitamin and potentially on, you know, medical foods, from a pure nutrition standpoint, it might be not worth the battle, but from like a mom standpoint of wanting to have a variety of foods, just keep offering and sort of not making it a battle, but just an option, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
That's true for any kid, not just a kid who has special needs or special dietary needs.
So we'll take one more question on this panel.
Hi there. I'm hoping to get your thoughts on if kids and adults too are able to get all their essential amino acids from food instead of taking formula, and if that depends on their protein intake or their willingness to try new food or different kinds of food.
Yes, all of that. And so, you know, it depends on, well, one, where they are on that spectrum, first of all, right? You know, I do think being very mindful about where the protein sources are coming from is also going to be really important. If their only protein source is French fries, it's going to take a lot more grams of protein to meet those essential amino acid needs, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the idea with the formula, is that we can give a smaller amount of amino acids and protein in order to get sort of a bigger bang for our buck. But providing measured amounts of what we call high biological value protein. So the easiest is meat, but we don't necessarily look at that. We look at other sort of plant sources, or, you know, smaller protein sources of high biological value protein. And what that means is that those foods have all of the essential amino acids in the right amount. Because I think one thing I didn't mention is that in order to build protein, you have to have access to all of those essential amino acids at that time. And so if your diet is limiting and even just one of those essential amino acids, you're going to start to break down your own sort of muscle protein to get that just one amino acid. And that's just like eating a steak, right? Like that's the muscle that we eat, just like it's, you know, in our body. So I think it is possible to do that, and many of my patients are not on any sort of essential amino acid, but they have to be very mindful of how much protein they're getting and where it's coming from.
Okay, great. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah.
The other thing to remember is that different plants have different constitutions of amino acids. So sometimes you have to have more than one plant source to get a complete set of essential amino acids.
Yeah. I think the best sort of example of that is rice and beans. That's something that's often served together, but that's also sort of evolutionary, like historical, because those two things together make a complete amino acid, or make a complete protein. It gives you all of those amino acids in the right amount.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists.